There comes a time in the life of every nation when it must decide whether to stand tall or bow its head. For India, that moment arrived when the United States applied its usual pressure, demanding compliance, expecting obedience, and assuming the old dynamic of dominance would hold firm. Washington was convinced that India would follow instructions, as many nations have done before, but instead, something remarkable happened. India said no, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet, resolute defiance. That single act of refusing to bend humiliated the United States more than any direct confrontation ever could. Because here is the truth, humiliation is not always delivered through war or speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes humiliation comes in silence. It comes when power is met with calm indifference, when a giant expects submission and instead is met with dignity and refusal. That is exactly what India did. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not just a word in a constitution, it is a living, breathing force, and when a nation embraces it fully, it becomes untouchable. The U.S. had grown used to controlling narratives. It had grown used to dictating terms, enforcing sanctions, and shaping the policies of others under the weight of its influence. For decades, smaller nations yielded, not because they wanted to, but because they felt they had no choice. But India is not a small nation. It is a civilization stretching back thousands of years, forged through struggle, colonization, and the pursuit of freedom. When the pressure came, India's response carried with it the weight of history. It was not merely a rejection of one policy, it was a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Think about the psychology of that moment. The United States is a country that thrives on the image of leadership. To be told no on the global stage, to be defied openly by a country it once viewed as an ally in training, was more than a diplomatic setback. It was a crack in the mirror of its own self-image. For a superpower, perception is everything. And when the world saw India resist, they also saw that America's influence was not invincible. That is humiliation in its purest form, when the myth of inevitability is shattered. But let's be clear, India's defiance was not reckless. It was not an act of arrogance. It was calculated, disciplined, and rooted in principle. That is why it carried such power. India didn't shout. India didn't threaten. India simply stood still while the storm of pressure blew around it, and when the dust settled, the U.S. realized it had been ignored. There is nothing more humbling for a nation that prides itself on authority than to realize its demands have lost their grip. This is where the lesson lies, not just for nations, but for individuals. Too often in life, people think that strength is measured in aggression or noise, but true strength is measured in resolve. It is in the ability to say, I will not bend, I will not be moved, I will not sacrifice my dignity for approval. That is the lesson India gave the world. And that is why this single act resonated far beyond geopolitics. It became a psychological blueprint for independence. For decades, the U.S. wielded its dominance like a weapon, believing no country could resist. But India's refusal exposed a deeper truth. Influence only lasts as long as people agree to recognize it. The moment you stop playing by someone else's rules, their power begins to fade. The United States, for the first time in a long time, was reminded that even giants can be defied, and even the strongest must face the reality of limits. Now think about what that meant for the ordinary Indian citizen watching this unfold. For generations, India had been painted as a follower in the global order, a developing nation still catching up. Suddenly, the entire world was watching India stand its ground. That moment gave people not just pride, but belief. And belief is the most dangerous weapon in the hands of the oppressed. When people begin to believe in themselves, they no longer accept being second-class players. They no longer bow. That is how transformation begins from within, one act of defiance at a time. And of course, the humiliation of the U.S. was not just symbolic, it had ripple effects. Other nations saw it and realized that perhaps they too could question Washington's authority. The myth of absolute dominance cracked, and once a myth cracks, it can never be restored to its former glory. India had not just humiliated America, it had shifted the psychology of the world order that is far more powerful than any single political move. You see, the most courageous decision is not the one made in comfort, but the one made when everyone expects you to fold. That is what India did. It chose sovereignty over subservience, principle over pressure, dignity over obedience. And in that moment, it reminded us all that greatness is not about how loud you can shout, but about how firmly you can stand when the weight of the world is pressing down on your shoulders. So when you reflect on this moment, don't see it as distant geopolitics. See it as a mirror for your own life. Ask yourself, when pressure comes, will you bow or will you stand? Will you let others dictate your choices, or will you claim your independence with quiet confidence? India's bold move was a lesson not just for nations, but for every human being. The power of saying no, when it matters most, can change everything, and that is why this act humiliated the U.S., because it proved that power is never absolute. It is only as strong as the obedience it receives. The day India said no was the day America was forced to confront its limits, and that humiliation will echo for years to come. When a nation stands up to pressure, the world watches closely. But what India did next was even more extraordinary. It didn't just resist the weight of American influence. It turned outward and built stronger bridges with others. That was the second blow, the one that made Washington realize it had miscalculated. Because the U.S. expected isolation to follow defiance, it believed India would weaken itself by rejecting American demands, but instead India multiplied its strength through alliances, showing that in today's world no country has to stand alone. This was not just a matter of economics or defense contracts, it was about shifting the entire architecture of global power. For decades, the U.S. enjoyed a near monopoly on partnerships. Its alliances were considered the only game in town. But India shattered that illusion by deepening ties with Russia, engaging with the Middle East, and aligning with Asian giants like China on certain interests while simultaneously keeping doors open to Europe. India revealed a new kind of strategy, a multipolar strategy. It was not about following one master, it was about creating balance, leveraging relationships, and crafting a future where India itself became a hub, not a spoke, and this is where the humiliation for America cut deepest. Because the U.S. thrives on the illusion that it is indispensable, its foreign policy often rests on the belief that without American approval, no major player can advance. Yet here was India, not only advancing but expanding its reach, without waiting for Washington's blessing. That was the moment the U.S. realized its role as gatekeeper of global influence was slipping away. The brilliance of India's move lay in its timing. While the U.S. was trying to contain, restrict, and punish, India was engaging, connecting, and expanding. That contrast was undeniable. Where America tried to draw lines, India built bridges, and the world respected it, because respect is not won by coercion. It is won by choice. Nations chose to engage with India not out of fear, but out of opportunity. That is the essence of true leadership, when others are drawn to you not because they are forced, but because they believe in what you bring to the table. Look at the psychology here. America has long defined strength as dominance. Its model of power is about control. India, on the other hand, projected a different kind of strength. The strength of independence paired with cooperation. That paradox was powerful, because it showed you can be self-reliant without being isolated, and you can be cooperative without being submissive. That balance humiliated the U.S. because it proved that its old formulas no longer work. But beyond geopolitics, think about the lesson for individuals. Many people believe that standing up for yourself means cutting ties or rejecting others, but India's example shows something greater. True independence is not about isolation, it's about choosing your connections wisely. It's about saying, I don't need you, but I choose to work with you because it benefits both of us. That is the mindset of champions. That is the mindset of nations destined to rise. India knew it could not challenge the United States by force, so it challenged it by relevance. If America wanted to isolate India, then India would make itself too valuable to be ignored. Energy deals with Russia, defense cooperation with France, technology exchanges with Israel, and economic partnerships across Asia. Each of these threads formed a web that even Washington could not cut through. Suddenly, America realized that pushing India away didn't weaken India, it weakened America, and that realization stung because humiliation often comes not from defeat, but from discovering that your opponent no longer needs you. This is the nature of real power in the modern world. It is not about who has the loudest voice, but about who has the most options. Options create leverage, options create freedom, options create dignity. And India, through its bold alliances, showed the world that its options were wide open. The United States, by contrast, discovered its leverage was shrinking. That was humiliation at a strategic level. And here's the deeper truth. Every individual, every nation, every leader faces the same choice. Do you tie your future to the approval of one power, one person, one system? Or do you expand your horizon, diversify your relationships, and make yourself unshakable? Because when you build multiple pillars of support, no one can pull you down. India understood this. That is why, instead of crumbling under pressure, it built a stronger foundation than ever before. This was more than just politics. It was philosophy in action, the philosophy that strength is not about dependence and respect is not about obedience. By embracing that philosophy, India exposed the outdated mentality of the United States. And the irony is, the louder America tried to remind the world of its dominance, the more irrelevant it looked in comparison to India's quiet, calculated strategy. So let's not mistake this moment as just a diplomatic maneuver. It was a psychological shift that sent ripples across continents. Other nations watched India and asked themselves, if India can defy and still thrive, why can't we? That is how movements begin, through example. And that is why the U.S. felt humiliated, not only because of what India did, but because of what it inspired others to imagine. And this is the message I want to leave you with. Alliances are not chains, they are choices. The stronger your choices, the weaker your enemies become. India proved that no one nation should dictate the destiny of another, and you, as individuals, can learn from this too. Build your alliances in life, not out of dependence, but out of strength. Surround yourself with those who respect your independence, not those who demand your obedience, because in the end, the measure of power is not how many people you can force to follow you. The measure of power is how many people choose to walk beside you. And in that measure, India rose and America fell. After alliances came something even more unsettling for America. The realization that India's economy was no longer fragile enough to be bent by threats or manipulated through pressure. For years, Washington operated on the assumption that economic leverage was its ultimate weapon. Sanctions, restrictions, tariffs, these were the tools of choice. They had worked on countless nations, forcing them into compliance. But when they were aimed at India, something unexpected happened. The weapon backfired. India did not collapse under the weight of American economic pressure. Instead, it stood taller. And this is what truly humiliated the United States, because it revealed that America had miscalculated the strength of India's foundation. The days when a single sanction or a tariff threat could dictate policy were gone. India's economy had become too large, too resilient, and too interconnected with the world to be broken so easily. Think about the symbolism of this moment. For decades, the U.S. economy was treated as the sun around which all others revolved. If Washington pulled its light away, nations were expected to wither in the dark. But India showed that it had its own fire, its own gravity, its own ability to sustain growth. It proved that its strength was not borrowed from another, but created from within. And that shift was psychological as much as it was financial. The truth is, economic power is not measured simply by numbers or trade balances. It is measured by resilience. It is measured by how much pressure you can absorb without breaking. America underestimated that resilience. It believed India was still dependent on Western approval, on Western markets, on Western aid. But India had spent years building an internal strength, a vast consumer base, a thriving technology sector, an agricultural backbone, and a rising manufacturing force. That was the quiet preparation that nobody in Washington fully recognized until it was too late. And this is where the humiliation deepens, because America's strategy was not just about economics, it was about psychology. When you sanction a country, you are not simply cutting off resources. You are sending a message: we control your destiny. For decades, this message worked. Countries bowed, leaders caved, populations suffered in silence, but India broke that pattern. By refusing to crumble, it sent a message back: you do not control us, we control ourselves. That reversal shook the very foundation of America's self-image. Now, imagine the ripple effect. If one nation can resist, others will take notice. India's economic defiance became an example, a living proof that Washington's economic weapons were not unstoppable. That is why humiliation stung so deeply. It wasn't just about India. It was about the fear that others might follow, because when one voice says no, it gives courage to the next. But let's pause here and look deeper. What does this mean beyond geopolitics? What does this mean for us as individuals? The lesson is powerful. True wealth is not about dependence. True wealth is not about showing off numbers or possessions. It is about resilience. It is about building a foundation so strong that no outside force can dictate your life. Just like India, if you build your strength from within, threats lose their power over you. The person who cannot be shaken financially, emotionally, or mentally is the person who is truly free. This is why India's economic strength mattered more than any weapon, because it was not just about growth, it was about dignity. America's humiliation was not that India became richer. The humiliation was that India became untouchable, and untouchability in the economic realm is the ultimate form of independence. Look at how India positioned itself in energy, in technology, in trade routes. It diversified, it adapted, it invested in its own market, its own people, its own industries. While others relied on handouts and foreign approval, India built something lasting. That is why when America tried to pull the rug, India was still standing. That resilience is what made the U.S. realize its limits, and here's the irony: the more pressure America applied, the stronger India appeared. Every attempt to weaken it only revealed how much power it already had. That is the paradox of resilience. You don't notice it until someone tries to break it, and when it holds firm, it inspires awe, and in this case, humiliation for those who underestimated it. So what does this teach us? It teaches us that power is not about dominance, it is about endurance. The greatest victories in life are not when you crush your opponent, but when you outlast them. America tried to break India's economy, but India outlasted the storm. And that outlasting spoke louder than any speech, louder than any protest. It was the quiet declaration of strength that made the world sit up and pay attention. Think of your own life. How often do we feel crushed by external pressures, by the expectations of others, by financial struggles, by voices telling us what we can or cannot achieve? The instinct is to panic, to bend, to surrender. But India's example shows us another path: the power of resilience, the dignity of standing firm, the strength of building something within that no one else can touch. That is the kind of strength that not only survives pressure, but humiliates those who try to break it. India's economic defiance was not about arrogance, it was about identity. It was about saying to the world, we are not defined by your approval, we are defined by our own strength. That is the lesson every individual, every community, and every nation must learn. Because when you rely solely on the approval of others, you are vulnerable. But when you build your own strength, you become unstoppable. And that is why the U.S. felt humiliated. It had relied for too long on the illusion of control. India shattered that illusion by proving that independence is not gifted by anyone, it is claimed. When India stood its ground, when it built alliances and proved the strength of its economy, something much bigger was happening in the background. The humiliation of the United States was not just about one nation being defied. It was about the slow collapse of an idea that had dominated the world for decades, the belief that America alone was the center of global power. That belief was fading, and India's bold move became the symbol of a new reality, the rise of a multipolar world. For nearly a century, the United States had carried itself as the unquestioned leader. After the Second World War, after the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was America that stood tall, proclaiming itself the indispensable nation, and for a time that title held weight. But history does not move in straight lines. Power is never permanent, and what the world is witnessing now is the return of balance, a world where no single nation can dominate, no single power can dictate, and no single voice can silence the others. India's defiance of Washington was more than just resistance. It was the declaration that the age of unipolarity is over, because when one country refuses to bend, it creates space for others to do the same. When one nation challenges the myth of inevitability, it inspires others to believe in their own sovereignty, and when that happens, the world begins to tilt toward equilibrium. That is exactly what we are seeing today, a multipolar order taking shape before our eyes. The humiliation for America lay in the realization that its word was no longer final. For decades, American presidents could make a statement, and it would be treated as the global line of truth. Today, that is no longer the case. Nations weigh America's voice against others, against Russia, against China, against Europe, against rising powers like India, Brazil, and beyond. That balance of voices, that diversity of power, is what terrifies Washington most. Because its dominance was not just about strength, it was about monopoly, and India helped break that monopoly. But let's take this beyond politics and into the psychology of power. Monopolies thrive on fear. They tell you there is no alternative, no other path, no other source of strength. But once you see an alternative, the monopoly dies. That is what India gave the world, an example that there is always another way. And once people see that, the old fear loses its grip. America was humiliated because the world no longer fears it in the way it once did. Think about this in your own life. How many times do we accept control from others because we believe there are no alternatives? We stay silent in jobs, in relationships, in systems that suffocate us, because we think there is no other way. But the truth is, the moment you see another path, you are free. The moment you realize the chains are only as strong as your belief in them, they shatter. That is the deeper meaning of a multipolar world. It is not just about politics. It is about human freedom. India's stand proved that the old order is cracking. Trade no longer flows through one gatekeeper. Technology no longer belongs to one country. Energy no longer depends on one supplier. The future belongs to those who diversify, who adapt, who refuse to be trapped by the illusion of dependence. That is why India's move mattered. It was not just a diplomatic maneuver, it was a statement of philosophy. No one owns the world, and no one ever will. And let's be clear, this shift is not chaos, it is balance. A multipolar world is not about endless competition, it is about shared responsibility. It is about recognizing that strength can be distributed, that leadership can be collective, that no nation has the right to dictate the destiny of all others. India's boldness accelerated that shift, forcing the world to confront a truth that America had long denied. The era of unilateral supremacy is finished. The humiliation of the United States, then, was not simply in being defied by India. It was in being confronted by history itself. History always moves toward balance. Empires rise and empires fall. Power concentrates and then it spreads. America had convinced itself that it was immune to this law. India reminded the world that no one is, and this is where the lesson touches each of us, because power is never permanent, not for nations, not for individuals. The question is not whether you can hold power forever. The question is whether you can adapt when the balance shifts. The United States is struggling with that question right now. India embraced it, and that difference is what made the world take notice. So, as you reflect on this, ask yourself, are you clinging to control, or are you embracing balance? Are you demanding dominance, or are you building cooperation? Because just as in geopolitics, in life too, the future belongs to those who understand the power of balance. The strongest individuals are not those who rule over others, but those who can walk alongside equals, who can share leadership, who can thrive in a world without monopolies. India's bold move humiliated the United States not just because it refused to comply, not just because it built alliances, not just because its economy proved resilient, but because it symbolized the dawn of something greater, the birth of a world where no one nation dictates terms. That humiliation was also liberation. For the first time in generations, nations everywhere could see a future where they are not pawns in someone else's game, but players in their own right, and that is the final message. Power is not about control, it is about balance. History always seeks it. Nations rise when they embrace it. Individuals thrive when they live it, and those who deny it, those who cling to dominance at all costs, will always eventually be humiliated by reality. Remember this, in a world of many powers, the greatest strength is not to rule over others, but to walk among them as an equal. That is the future India helped to shape, and that is the lesson we must all carry forward.